Hello and welcome to the business community. My name is Jaime Martinez and I work for the UTSA COVID Business Recovery Accelerator. Again, I want to welcome everybody to this brand new year, and our kickoff to the year is getting our COVID business town halls started up again for the new year. And we've been planning this particular town hall and very interesting subject matter, and hopefully be able to clear up some confusion and also provide resources and guide to assistance on the global supply chain disruption. I'm very excited to have some esteemed professors from the UTSA's Carlos Alvarez's College of Business here. And so we will go ahead and provide you some great information, and let's go ahead and get started. I will, I'd like to be able to introduce everybody. But first, before I do that, I'd like to be able to just, those of you who are not familiar with us, with the Small Business Development Center's COVID Business Recovery Accelerator, let me kind of get into a little bit about who we are. I won't spend a lot of time because I really do want to dive into some of the questions I have for our esteemed and host panelists today. So, just real quick, as usual on any virtual events that I'm sure you all participated on, use the chat box on the right-hand side where you can type in the questions. My right hand, my colleague Diego Patillo, as you all can see, will be in charge of the chat box and answering some of the questions. She will hold on to the relevant questions for Drs. Roy, Lung, and Kirimi, and we'll answer those towards the end, but we have to start with some of the questions that we have prepared for them today. And please, it is very important to us because we are a grant-funded program. We do want to hear from you. We also mainly want to hear from you about any kind of training topics, any outreach topics that you'd like to hear. For example, like supply chain that you'd like to get more information about. So please, answer those surveys immediately after the presentation you'll get by email. So the Small Business Development Center has been around for about 40 years now. We are not new at all to assisting small, medium-sized businesses, micro businesses in our Southwest Texas SBDC border network. We've been doing it for a long time. All of the accelerators barely been around 2 years now, but our vision for this particular program is providing the resources, the information to help your small business find relief, reboot your business, find recovery and become resilient, during, still, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not just here at the University of Texas San Antonio. We cover, our network covers 79 counties in our Southwest Texas border network. As you can see here, the different cities that we cover, and then those cities take care of the surrounding counties and their communities. So please reach out to us. We'd be happy to place you in contact with the most appropriate Small Business Development Center in your area if you're here in Texas, or with the 20 some odd that we have here in the entire state, or the over 1,000 that we have throughout the United States. So please feel free to reach out to us. The service that we provide on a one-on-one, at no cost, confidential basis is helping you find the funding. If you're an employer, the resources to manage your business better and your employees. Cybersecurity, helping you protect your business, keep your files safe, and all that type of information. Prepare the next and hopefully not too a very, very long time from now, but next natural or this type of virus novel disaster we're going through, and workplace safety issues going through in your particular business. So this particular topic, if we do discuss anything on legal or tax advice, we are not attorneys, we're not CPAs, but we do always recommend that we always reach out to them. Just a quick little disclaimer. But let's go ahead and get right into the introductions of our panelists. Dr. Mark Lung. Dr. Lung is the chair and professor of management science in the Department of Management Science and Statistics with the UTSA Carlos Alvarez College of Business. He joined the university in 1999, so he's been around for quite a while. Holds a doctorate in operations management and a master's of business in operations management from Indiana University. His MBA in finance, quantitative analysis from the University of California, Riverside, and a bachelor's in business economics for University of California there in Santa Cruz. So he teaches at the undergraduate level, graduate, and doctoral levels. So as you can see, Dr. Leung has a lot of expertise in this particular field. So thank you, Dr. Leung, for joining us today. Next, I have the honor to introduce Dr. Amir Karimi. Professor Karimi is an assistant professor in the Management Science and Statistics Department at the University of Texas here in San Antonio. He received his PhD in Supply Chain and Operations from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management. Professor Karimi's research focuses on strengthening public health supply chains in developing countries where the shortages of essential health commodities are widespread and frequent due to resource constraints. So, Dr. Karimi, thank you for joining us today. Happy to have you here. And last but certainly not least, you'll see a special guest and his camera pop in here and there. Dr. Arkajyoti Roy. Dr. Roy is an assistant professor in the Management Science and Statistics Department, housed also in the College of Alvarez School of Business, at the University of Texas in San Antonio. Research focuses is on the use of robust decision-making models and data analytics to improve end user outcomes in healthcare, marketing, and marginalized populations. In healthcare, he develops decision-making models for medical treatments, data-driven tools for treatment evaluation and quality controls, as well as scheduling models for diagnostics and operations. In marketing, he develops decision-making models to better manage customer relationships. For marginalized communities, he seeks to inform decision makers on providing sustainable service using data analytics. So thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. This is great. We've been planning this, to the business community for a little while to clear up possibly some of the misconceptions, provide resources, have a great discussion and a consistent discussion on the disruption that has been going on for a while now in the supply chain. And as I'd like to go ahead and get started out, Drs. Leung, Roy, Karimi, the Small Business Administration described an article that it wrote up called The Supply Squeeze. As the COVID-19 pandemic evolves, small businesses are struggling. That's our main focus in our SBDCs throughout the United States, to obtain the goods that they need to operate, that's impacting their recovery, part of the resource providing. And unfortunately, we're getting them through the rebooting, the relief, but the recovery, it's a hard part, because 37.2% of small businesses have reported having domestic supplier delays. Anywhere between businesses that could have 1 or 2 employees, or the ones that have a couple of hundred, which can be our clients. And these supplier delays in the second week of June, for example, of last year, and increases in commodity costs are still a growing concern, even in going into this particular year. So going forward, small businesses and their advocates, would really need to carefully monitor changes in their commodity pricing, as for what we see and what we continue to see for our clients. I mean, we hear it on the news every day. So let's gentlemen, let's get right into the question. So, Dr. Leung, let's start with you. We know that the pandemic, has had an impact. Obviously, we hear it every day on the global supply chain, right? Not just in Texas, South Texas, where we're at, but let's start from the beginning. Do you have a perspective on how really the supply chain disruption, developed? How did it all start out?
Now, a lot of times when we talk about supply chain, we emphasize the word supply, but the people have to understand when we talk about supply chain, it's a more generic term. It encompasses both supply side and the demand side. So without the demand side, which is the customers, or some of you guys, the owners, then the supply chain will not work. So when we talk about disruption, the effect will not only be on the suppliers and manufacturers, but also on the customers and anybody else basically downstream in the supply chain. So anything happen in the middle or even at the end of the supply chain, it will cause the disruption of this. So for example, some of the suppliers back in China, they are not able to open the factory because they locked down. Then we don't get the parts. So because we don't get the parts, we cannot continue with the manufacturing. So of course, there's a shortage. But on the other side, if you think about the other end or the other spectrum of the supply chain, because many people right now, you go to the supermarket, you see there's like a panic buying. Everybody else is trying to stock up with the canned food, instant noodles, toilet papers. Because of this sudden impact on the supply chain, the higher side, which means the supplier, the manufacturer, are not able to catch up. It will also cause a shortage. Not to mention, because of the COVID issue, there is delay in logistical supports, like container ship will take much longer to dock, upload and unload. It may even take much longer for the container trucks to deliver the materials from one point to another point. So anything can happen inside. So which means that there are a lot of uncertainties, but any of this uncertainty breaks down, then it won't work. So it's very fragile, in my opinion.
Okay, interesting. So same to you. So same question to you, Dr. Karimi. So talk to us. I mean, from what you're currently doing, talk to us about your view as to what really started the supply chain disruption. How did developed?
Yeah. So to build up on what Dr. Long said, I would really classify the causes as both on the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, when you have many of the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies in the U.S. that have suppliers in China, in a select few countries, when those regions in China are hit by a pandemic, I'm speaking specifically about the start of the pandemic, you experience plant closures and those things, then this leads to a disruption in the supply chain because you're not going to be able to get the parts. And obviously at the focal plant, they're going to be losing personnel due to COVID, fractured transportation links. I'm talking about a shortage of truck drivers. We're not able to deliver the products. Ports clogged up. And then what we've been seeing also recently on the supply side is corporate hoarding behavior. So we've seen the grocery stores particularly stocking up on a lot of things, just purchasing a lot of everything compared to the same time last year. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side also, there have been things that have contributed to the shortages and the disruption. So there has been a change in consumer preferences. So when we went into lockdown, everyone started working from home, then all of a sudden you have new needs, right? So maybe you're looking at your living room, you feel like, okay, maybe I need to change this furniture, right? Maybe I need to paint this wall. I need more electronic gear and all that kind of stuff. So all of a sudden there is this surge in demand for all these products. And if you pair that with the lack of supply, then this further increases the shortages. So I think this is what kind of differentiates, makes this disruption due to the COVID pandemic unique compared to other disruptions, that you're facing both a supply shock and a demand shock. Because if you think of, let's say, the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster, that was more of a supply shock. Mm-hmm. There was not much of a demand shock there. You look at the recession in 2009, that was more of a demand shock. There's not much of a supply shock. So here we're experiencing both.
Interesting, but I would have, a new phrase I just learned you said earlier when you first started speaking is the corporate hoarding. I haven't, that's something, a little bit different that I did, even though at that particular level that they were even, hoarding at that particular level. Interesting. Okay. Dr. Roy, now that you're, if you can, while you're feeding there, and we're happy to have your special guest join us today. So talk to us about, from your point of view, and adding on to what Drs. Leung and Karimi, mentioned, talk to us about what you think on the start of this supply chain disruption.
Yeah, and I apologize for having my 5-month-old with me, but this is real life resiliency. She had some COVID exposures, and so she's home, and I'm on childcare duties because my wife's on the other childcare duty teaching class. So coming from a supply chain perspective, I think some of the key things that happened in this disruption from the pandemic is we weren't so resilient. One of the things that we saw was the semiconductor shortages that happened during this last pandemic. And what we learned is that we did not take into account some of the longer lead times that semiconductors have. And so that created a shortage, and that created then issues with production of motor vehicles, because that's where the semiconductors were going into, right? And so we kind of underestimated those lead times in terms of supply, and then coming from a demand perspective, we also didn't take into account what was going to happen in the recovery after the sort of the market kind of shut down during the early phases of the pandemic. So post February 2020, demand kind of went down. The supply section kind of thought, okay, the forecasting estimates were much lower, and we thought, okay, we were not going to produce as much. Turns out the economy recovered fairly well, and then there was this boom of demand. And then these longer lead time production systems weren't able to catch up with that, and therefore ended up with this sort of supply chain disruption.
Okay, interesting. Wow. Okay, so, well, thank you for providing us that insight on, really from your professional point of view on, how the disruption started in various parts of the corporate world, and even at the supermarket level, and the corporate hoarding, which is something I learned today. Dr. Roy, let's continue with you on the next question. I mean, what does it mean for a product to be a part of the global supply chain? And the other part of it, so that particular product, the scarcity of it, how does it affect pricing? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so nowadays, the lean manufacturing principles are all about keeping the lowest amount of inventory and minimizing costs. And that's been sort of the focus recently before the pandemic and during the sort of the early phases of the pandemic. But what we realize is that when we are so, I would say, used to or we rely on one section of the global sort of production system, let's say China, for example, when production shuts down in that area, we have no supply. And so products becomes much, much more scarce. And as a result, then prices go up, and it creates this chain of effects. Now, one of the things to sort of address that is to diversify different areas of production. A new strategy a lot of firms have sort of come into is called China Plus One, where you have Chinese production plus possibly diversifying in areas such as Thailand, Indonesia, in that region, so that it makes it a little bit more resilient, so that when one country shuts down, you're not completely in trouble. Now, there are some other issues that can happen where there's more regional crisis, such as in the 1997 Asian financial crisis that happened, or 2004, there was a tsunami. That can, of course, affect it. And so, managers might be encouraged to move more regional, let's say bringing in your production to in South America or Mexico. But again, just like in portfolios, you want to diversify your portfolio. So similarly in supply chains, diversifying does help in that aspect.
Yeah. By the way, very well behaved baby. This is fantastic. So we got to offer that every time. Thanks, Dr. Roy, on that one. So same over to you, Dr. Karimi. So, how, I guess we're going off of what, Dr. Roy had mentioned. I mean, product being a part of the global supply chain, how does scarcity affect pricing? I like the fact that, Dr. Rose mentioning, China plus one, and we always discuss with our clients to pivot, and plan for, the work, don't always focus on that one supplier, maybe better pricing, things like that. So, talk to us about it, maybe feed off a little bit of what Dr. Roy had mentioned.
I'll just provide a couple of examples to make this more clear. So when a product is part of a global supply chain, that means that the different parts that are needed to produce that product could be sourced from areas that are geographically dispersed across the world. So think of bottled water, for instance. That's a simple product. And even for such a simple product, there are different components that are needed. You need, first of all, the water, the bottle, the paper label, and also the cap. So all these different components need to be in place to produce that product. And these could be sourced from different locations. Perhaps maybe the paper label could be produced in New Zealand. The cap could be in China. So that makes bottled water part of a global supply chain. And even after the product is manufactured, it would still be distributed globally to different markets. So again, on the demand side, it could also be part of the global supply chain. And on the second part of your question about scarcity and pricing, so again, this goes back to supply and demand. So in normal times, there is some equilibrium between supply and demand. That means that there is as much demand as there is supply. Now, when there's a disruption, there's a shortage. That means that companies cannot produce as much. So demand is going to be more than supply. And as a result, that means that there is more demand than there is supply. So not everyone is going to be able to access the product that they need. And this means that people might be willing to pay more for the product to outcompete everyone else. So this leads to an increase in prices. Now, I would say there are two things that could bring the prices back down. One of them is for the manufacturers to increase their supply to meet the demand. So that could help bring the prices down. And that is not happening in this case because of the continued disruption. Yeah. The other way how the prices could come back down is if I know that, okay, this product I'm purchasing, maybe it's a tablet, it's $100 more expensive today. If I know I can wait a couple of weeks or a month maybe, and by then the price is going to come down, then I could wait and the prices would perhaps come down. But if this duration of wait time could be long, could be maybe 6 months or a year, then I'm willing to pay that much. So and that is what is happening here, that the pandemic is turning out to be much longer than we anticipated. So that's why we keep seeing prices staying high, and consumers are still willing to pay for that.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Lung, I mean, same to you. I guess feeding off of what your colleagues just mentioned. I mean, talk to us about, I guess continue on with that particular point.
I am completely in line with what Dr. Roy and Dr. Karimi said in this, but let me summarize what they are talking about in one very interesting concept. And that is like, when we are trying to operate at a global level, and actually most of the supply chains these days are operating at a global level, it rests on a very delicate balance of what we call the cost, and also what we call the responsiveness, and which is the ability and how easy we are going to address all these disruption, uncertainties, and so on. So in the past, when things were operating at more or less the idealistic situation, so there was no major disruption, there's no COVID, there was no major tsunami, weather conditions, and so on. A lot of these global supply chains were designed in an optimal manner, which means that our logistics, our manufacturing, and the operations, they were more or less at the optimal or near optimal level. But because it encompasses basically, some parts are made in China, but some other parts are made in Japan, and the case of this is made in Indonesia, but with some chips in South Korea. So we are going to get all these parts together and ship to, let's say, Vietnam and Taiwan to put the whole machine together and eventually come to the US for further processing. So it based on like 40 different countries of parts. So anything else wrong in these 40 countries, then something is going to happen in a bad manner. Okay, it can be expected or it can be unexpected. So the question is, how much are these global supply chains, which involves manufacturers, suppliers, and even consumers, not to mention wholesalers and retailers, are willing to pay additionally or a premium, just like we are buying the insurance to prevent this kind of things from happening. Of course, it means that a higher level of the price, but how much we are willing to pay in order to prevent this disruption from happening in the future. That can be a very interesting question. We have to see how the economy evolves. Yes, I do agree that the price will generally go down, but it will not be going down back to the level pre-pandemic, because I believe that a lot of companies, they already made the announcement that they are going to have more domestic production and they are going to have more decentralized operations. Now, we knew that you lose economy of scale, you lose the efficiency. But when you have more decentralized ones, means that you have more factories all around the world. You are building in some of the manufacturing process in the US. It's going to be expensive. But the chance that you will be affected by, let's say, my container ship cannot dock in LA, so I have to wait for 2 weeks for production. It won't exist anymore. So consider this as a premium, then some company may actually want to do it. And
Wow.
Intel, Walmart, they already announced plans in doing so.
Wow. I mean, I've heard from all three of you now, some consistency, what price, what premium are companies, are the consumer willing to pay, for something. And it's not just having a plan B, but C and D and E and then some, and also, it's interesting, they're pivoting, they're planning that after, the supply meets the demand, but the corporate world is planning already, for will prices go back, pre-pandemic, and you're saying that it's possibly not. That's something, very, very new that I have not heard in the news. And I like to say that I do watch and read it consistently. That is something very, very new. Okay, now interesting. Thank you, Dr. Lung, for that. Dr. Crimi, let's start the next question with you. So all of you, have already discussed with us, your what happened at the very beginning. We're catching up to where we are right now. We've talked a little bit about the future, but very little about where we're at. Where are we at right now in the global supply chain? I mean, and besides where we at right now, what is the federal government, doing? What specific actions are they taking, to jumpstart, getting the supplies back to meeting demand? Where are we at right now, and what are they doing?
Yeah, the economy has been trying to go back up, but what's also complicating things is the new variants that come and go, forcing new restrictions to be in place. In terms of the federal government and strengthening supply chains to prevent future disruptions, I'm aware that the executive branch of the government, they've created a task force to identify vulnerabilities in the supply chains, particularly strengthening those related to semiconductors. And also, they're also focused on the domestic production of critical medications, including antibiotics. But I would say beyond federal government, there are also things companies could do to safeguard against future disruptions. So, for instance, carrying more inventory. Obviously, that's not a solution for every part or every product. It's not going to be practical or feasible. But for certain products, that could be a remedy. An example is what Toyota did after a careful evaluation of their supply chain after the Fukushima power plant disaster. They identified that they might need more chips, microchips. So they had more of those products stocked up. But even such a measure could safeguard against disruptions for a short period of time. So Toyota for some time was good in terms of microchips, but even now they're still facing those kind of disruptions, similar to other car manufacturers. Supplier diversification is another approach that companies could do. Instead of all your suppliers being concentrated in China, perhaps you could scatter them across multiple different countries, as Dr. Roy said. And there have also been industry consortiums to identify risk in supply chains and increase the safety of suppliers. So examples are the Alliance and Accord consortiums. These were created by textile manufacturers to increase the safety of suppliers in countries such as Bangladesh, to prevent disasters such as the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh.
Okay. Wow. Same over to you. Same over to you, Dr. Lung. Where are we at right now? I mean, what have you heard that the federal government? I mean, I know they have a task force. On how they continue to jumpstart this disruption in the supply chain. And before you start, I do want to remind our audience that please, if you have any questions, for our panelists, now's the time to ask them. So please make sure and you type in your questions in the chat. Again, Deidre will be monitoring that, and then we'll bring them up here as we come narrowing down to the close of our town hall. So, Dr. Lung, go ahead.
I'm going to tweak the question a little bit, because I think regarding your question on the federal level, there's a lot of like economic policies, how to stimulate the economy and how to foolproof our supply chain at a national level. But a lot of these kind of things still have to be done at a domestic level. I'm talking about the state government and municipal governments, because the federal government will provide the guidance, but regarding projects and exactly the execution and implementation dealing with a certain segment of the supply chain, or even a large corporation which dominates 60% of the business in this small town. It still have to be done at the municipal government level, otherwise it will not be effective. We cannot totally rely on the federal government to deal with this specific situation. Just think about a quick example is Toyota is moving down from the Midwest to San Antonio to build a production plant years ago. They were coming, but not only just Toyota is coming, but they're also bringing the supply chains coming down from the Midwest down to San Antonio as well, because we all knew that Toyota practice just-in-time manufacturing, which means that whenever they need the parts, whenever they need something, so they can get it ASAP. So nobody else is going to hold a lot of inventories and so on. Now, in that case, with this proximity, you have all the 40 different suppliers next to Toyota. How can you attract this huge big business? We knew that San Antonio government were competing with a lot of local governments in the past to get Toyota down here. So they expand the highway, they build the railroad, they give them preferable tax things. It works out very well right now. Look at the south side of San Antonio. You know, they really building up the economy. So a lot of these things, yes, with the encouragement, with the guidance, with the national policy of the federal, but I still believe the local government will have to take a strong lead in a lot of these kind of situations. Also think about like the winter blast last year, the Arctic blast. Now, of course, that is not the same, exactly the same as COVID, but the city itself, the Bexar County, will have to deal with a lot of this fine details in order to bring their business back up to the normal level again.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for throwing that in. I mean, you know, there's various names for it: snowpocalypse, snowvid. You know, I'm sure there's a few other, you know, other derogatory names that people made up for it because it was very, it was very stressful during that particular time. But you know, that's great to hear you mention that, Dr. Leung. You know, what the not just the federal level, but state, you know, the state levels, you know, the counties, the cities, municipal level, what they're doing, you know, to help the business community on you know, to kind of with this supply chain. And it's not just, you know, we're not just talking about, you know, COVID, but we're also talking about the weather, you know, and the climate issues that are there that can become a disaster. Okay, very interesting. You know, Dr. Roy, over to you. So, you know, please add to what your two colleagues have already discussed.
Yeah, let me expand a little bit about what happened from the executive side of the government. So the Biden-Harris administration had that 100-day review of supply chains of 4 critical products, and that was the semiconductors, both manufacturing and packaging. They also looked at large capacity batteries, such as those that are used in electric vehicles. They looked at minerals and materials, and then also pharmaceuticals. And they established the task force, as Dr. Karimi said, and then they sort of addressed and monitor short-term supply chain issues. And they met with stakeholders, they identified the bottlenecks, and sort of came up with solutions. For the longer term, I think more interestingly, the administration sort of said that they're going to prioritize security, sustainability, and resilience, and not just low cost, which sort of, according to the administration, that had been the focus previously. So because of sort of the shift in focus, the hope is that the next time disruption such as this happens, more long-term disruption, we are a little bit more resilient. They also said to, or proposed to sort of invest more in research of sustainable systems, productions, workers, and sort of help rebuild a sustainable manufacturing capacity across the country, right? So they proposed about a $50 billion investment in research of advanced manufacturing of semiconductors in the US. And that's a major commitment, sort of a proposal, not passed and everything, but that's sort of a major commitment that they're showing in this area. Now, outside of the federal level, both for companies and at a state level, I think it is important, like Dr. Leung said, to not just focus on the pandemic aspect, but also to think what happens when multiple disruptions happen at the same time, such as the weather and the pandemic coming together, right? There was, I live in Austin, and I can provide you with examples that I've seen personally in Austin, where multiple businesses came together, and these are small businesses. It's perfectly fit for this audience, actually, came together to solve each other's supply chain problems so that manufacturing could happen. And I'm talking about food trucks that were out of milk, and they couldn't make coffee, and restaurants that had milk but needed other supplies, and they were able to share those kind of inventory in order to make production happen. So I think that also shows that it's not just at the federal level, but both for individual producers as well as possibly at a state level, where we kind of need to work together to make the system more resilient and solve these problems.
I like that. I do remember, you know, Dr. Roy, you know, even not just at the local news, but national news, network news, that yes, they were talking about, competitors helping each other out, same industry, but also, those that don't necessarily compete, but use the same type of ingredients, raw materials, whatever, just figure out to get things done, and keep operating. And so very interesting. And so, I switching up my order on speakers, and maybe it's appropriate because she might be asleep. And so let's continue on with you, Dr. Roy. And so, what are you hearing? I mean, from the three of you, what are you hearing? And from some businesses, you touched a little bit on it, but what are you hearing from small businesses, medium, on other supply chain issues that they currently have?
So I can give you some examples. In the U.S. groceries market, one thing that we saw was there was sort of a problem adjusting to different types of demands. So one of the things that we saw early on in the pandemic was a shortage in toilet paper that we had, and everybody went crazy because we were getting ready for work from home, and the demand sort of skyrocketed and all the shelves got emptied out. Now, what we didn't see is there's also a toilet paper usage that happens in, let's say, restaurants and businesses. And turns out they actually use something like single ply toilet rolls, and at home we use double ply toilet rolls, right? The toilet papers that is more comfortable. And so it turned out that the in-home usage sort of skyrocketed, and the inventory for that completely went up, and it all finished off. But then the restaurants and the business owner had plenty of supplies to meet their demand. So what we saw in that aspect is it was very difficult to change production and sort of meet that demand, because some of these machines that make toilet paper is actually very, very large and very, very difficult to modify like very quickly. So one aspect that that was suggested as sort of part of future case studies and so on is studying how do we make these machines easier to shift gears and make sort of products that can address both needs, both type of needs. That was one example. Another example was sort of in the grocery section, we had competitors that where some competitors had their products and some competitors didn't have their products because of supply chain issues. And what we saw is the people who did end up not getting so disrupted by supply chain problems had a really good visibility of their network. What I mean by the network is, suppose Dr. Karimi gave a very good example of water bottles and water being a global supply chain. So mapping out that network of where the water is coming from, where the plastic bottle is coming from, where the labeling is coming from, who are the first tier suppliers, second tier suppliers, third tier suppliers. People who had a very good visibility of that network ended up being much more resilient to this disruption compared to folks who didn't have a good visibility of the network.
Wow. Okay. Yes. Thank you. No, that's very good. We'll go next to Dr. Karimi, and then we'll wrap it up with Dr. Lung, and then we'll get into the questions from the audience. From Deidre here in just a moment. So, Dr. Karimi, what are you hearing from some businesses on their supply issues? Maybe, and if you don't have any examples, maybe Dr. Lung has it, but even continue on with the small business or even at the micro business level.
Yeah, so I know the pandemic has not been easy to businesses, especially small businesses. I have a couple of examples to share. The first one is about a manufacturer of small manufacturer of furniture, and what I heard from them was that when there is a shortage, smaller manufacturers, smaller businesses get deprioritized, and that's in favor of larger corporations. So that's another factor that makes things even more complicated for small businesses. Then another example I have is about how some challenges could be turned into actual opportunities. So there is a company here in town in San Antonio. They deal with compost. You have some of these compost bins at your house, and then you put your organic matter in it, and then you drop it off at a location. So that's how the business operates. And they used to have some plastic bags that you needed to put inside the bucket. So you would put all the organic matter in there. What happened, which I heard that it was partly due to the COVID pandemic. There was a shortage of these plastic bags, so they didn't have that anymore. So you would just put the organic matter directly into the bucket. But due to this shortage, the company actually realized that they might not actually need the plastic bag anyways. So any benefits provided by those plastic bags, they were not large enough to justify any financial or environmental considerations. So this was one example of an unintended consequence of the pandemic and the disruption and the shortages that they turned into an opportunity.
Interesting. No, thank you, Dr. Nguyen, for that one. And to wrapping up the questions that I have for you all, Dr. Leung, and then we'll get right into Deidre. She, I have a message from her that we have some great questions from the audience, and so go ahead, Dr. Leung.
I think an interesting point many businesses would like to think about beyond what we just talked about in the normal, the COVID level, and all these things in the supply chain is about the replanning, I call it replanning, and redesign of their capacity. Now, this is true for almost all the business in the world, but the effect, the impact on the small business would be more pronounced because they have less resources to hedge against any uncertainty, and they also have less resource to deal with any shocks. Even smaller shocks can flip the small business. So what is this? It's the what I call the forward buying. Now, you think about this. At the COVID, I mean, during the early stage of the COVID, many people are panicked. Then they tend to buy a lot of things. Now, normally, unless we are the stars in the TV show called Hoarders, okay, we would not spend $600 buying toilet paper. We will not stock up 200 bottles of dishwashing detergent. We won't do this, okay, normal people. But now, because of the COVID, then we are buying more. Now, here is a little tricky part, which is the vicious cycle. When we go to the store and see more empty shelves, we may plan to buy only 1 or 2 bottles of bleach, but we see, wow, there are not much on the shelf. Let me buy 5 bottles. And when the people see you buy 5 bottles, other customer will buy 10. Then we keep on buying more and more. So the supply chain can never catch up with this vicious cycle. Now, then it is what Dr. Karimi, the corporate holders just kick in. Because of this, they are not able to have enough materials to produce. Then they start collecting inventory by themselves too. So everybody else in the supply chain is collecting more and more. So fewer and fewer will go to the consumer, which we can buy eventually. Okay, but here is another tricky part. Assuming COVID is not going to be forever, we are not going to be operating like this as a society for the next 500 years. So some point in time, the people will stop buying at the elevated level. Well, this is not something we are going to have like 1,000 rolls of toilet paper in the garage anymore. So there will be at least like half a year or 1 year. I don't need to buy it. So you see that we got all this sharp turn in the demand, and suddenly they will just drop like a cliff. For the small business owner, that means that I suddenly have no business in the next 6 months. What can I do about it? So they will have to think about redesign some of this capacity or the planning, maybe some other product lines, or maybe some way to catch up with this. But
Pivoting.
regarding exactly what to do, it depends on business to business.
Exactly. No, thank you for that, Dr. Lung. And let's get right into the questions, Deidre, that you mentioned. Please, I'll hand it over to you, and then you can just whoever wants to answer it. It's up to you.
Well, thank you so much. I also have to say, Dr. Roy and Dr. Lung, y'all apparently have a crystal ball, because some of the great information you have shared definitely came after some of the questions that were answered. And so, Dr. Roy, because you did, talk about some of the, challenges for manufacturing to maybe switch gears a little bit, we had a question about the different types of suppliers that maybe had to change their model for maybe that, the bulk purchaser to the immediate consumer. But I think that for small businesses, sometimes that's the same question, because many of our, especially food service related small businesses, are facing challenges. And so we have a question, where do you see, or when do you see the supply chain issues in the restaurant industry resolving? So, and I think this is both a availability and a price issue. So if you have any thoughts to share on that.
Yeah, I think in the overall aspect, it's hard to predict on industry specific forecasts, but on an overall economic perspective, the estimates have been sort of in the next 5 to 6 months, we should be at the end of sort of this troublesome period. I think from a small business perspective, it's actually kind of interesting because what I've read about small businesses in the San Antonio region, and I have some examples in sort of a small mom and pop shop that makes candles and gifts in that aspect, where the pivoting of suppliers was actually much easier, because when it takes, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 raw ingredients or raw materials to make your product, it is a lot easier to pivot and find a different supplier. So in this aspect, the candle producers were able to find a different glass manufacturer in the regional area rather than internationally, and was able to overcome the supply chain issues and become more resilient. I think in the food industry, it does become a little bit more difficult sometimes, especially when you're sourcing from producers. Let's say a lot of your stuff is coming from California and you have supply chain issues in that aspect. It becomes a little bit more difficult because you are getting very specific types of raw material. But in the general case, we're expecting in the next 5 to 6 months to be able to overcome this.
Thank you so much. And I don't think anyone's going to hold your feet to the fire, but I think everybody likes to have something to look toward when it comes to resiliency. I think also we had some really great questions about pricing and what some of the impacts on pricing are. Dr. Lung, are prices also affected by increases in wages and salaries, or is the major impact on supplies and materials from supplies?
I think they are all related. I mean, you cannot isolate one out of the other ones, because think about this. At the very beginning, maybe the supply chain, like manufacturers, suppliers, or even the wholesaler will have to absorb this kind of like shocks in the price. But eventually, they are going to raise the price. You know that they are not going to sell the things to us at a loss. So the price increase may not be sharp, even is progressive or gradually, but it will propagate through the supply chain, and eventually it will reach the retailer. So when retailer raise the price, consumer, we have to pay more. So no matter what, one way or the other, consumer will end up with paying more because of the changes upstream in the supply chain when the people try to do certain things which will protect or to make our supply chain more resilient and better in the future.
Thank you so much.
Stock up or build more facilities.
Very good. I have the feeling we could probably spend an entire hour on just that issue, but thank you so much. And Dr. Karimi, I am going to give you the opportunity to be a bright spot. What are the opportunities that you see in the current supply chain? And if they are perhaps COVID specific, or just, you know, in general, in terms of the issues of security, sustainability, and resiliency?
So, in terms of opportunities in the supply chain, is there a particular supply chain we're talking about here?
So that's the joy of small business. We are, if you have something particular, that's great. But if we can extrapolate that for a variety of industries, we welcome all attendees.
Yeah, I wonder if Dr. Long or Dr. Roy, do you have any insights on that?
I think opportunity-wise, one thing, and this is actually on Dr. Karimi's expertise areas, is sustainability. Because when supply chain has sort of had problems and you end up with idle time, it definitely gives you an opportunity to redesign the system and focus on sustainability and security and all those different resiliency and all those different things. So that's definitely an opportunity that a lot of firms are kind of catching up on if they are having supply chains, to not waste that time. And maybe Dr. Karimi, you have some insights on that aspect.
No, that's very true. I think that's the silver lining, perhaps, because until and unless there's a problem, you're not gonna dig in deeper to see, you know, what are the problems, or what are the things that we could improve. Again, going back to the example of compost beans, the removal of those plastic bags would have not happened if it wasn't for disruption in those supply chains. So sometimes these shortages, disruptions might cause us to rethink our strategies and lead to some improvement in the processes along the way.
Well, thank you. That you almost used our tagline. We constantly encourage small business owners to work on their business and not just in their business. And I think that some of them can use, you know, challenges or an opportunity to examine, you know, those strengths as well as those weaknesses. And so, Dr. Lung, if I could ask you, we were asked if you could please summarize a couple of key strategic implications for business strategies after learning, you know, what we have learned about the causes and impacts of supply chain disruption.
I think number one is be flexible. Because a lot of time, I understand that in small business, you know, we have less flexibility because of resources. I mean, we tend to operate in a very rigid lines of products and services. But if we can create some kind of like a flexibility just in case, then we will be better weather shocks and changes. Another one is the adaptability. So you see that even without the COVID, business, what the people likes in the world will keep on changing. We know that what we are buying, what we are doing right now compared to like 30 years ago, they were not all the same. So even without the COVID, we still have to make ourselves to renovate our business model, to renovate our product lines and services to keep up with the society, okay? But again, this tied to flexibility as well. And so the question is, how do we weather this and how do we do it? Then it comes to another interesting point is it a small business dealing with service? Because a lot of small business, when they have the service, then they add another layer of uncertainty and difficulty or challenge inside. Think about this. If you are, Deidre just mentioned the food industry. So on one side, I have to deal with the physical supply chain because of the food, okay, and the restaurant supplies. But on the other side, I have to deal with the intangible services. Because think about this. In the past, or in the traditional sense, when people come to the restaurant or food truck, if you don't see the food I want, or if you are close, then I will just walk out and go to another place. Right. So I demand, as a customer, I demand immediate service. So how can we protect ourselves? Because that also involves the staffing too. Food cannot be inventory that much. They are perishable. So how do we deal with this? I mean, this can be a little bit tricky, so require innovation.
Right. No, and thank you, Dr. Lung, for summarizing that. And you know, to our panelists today, you know, Drs. Lung, Karimi, Dr. Roy, thank you, gentlemen, all three of you, for participating with us today. We've hit the end of our, I know there's a few other questions, but we've hit the end of our event today, our you know, 2022 COVID Town Hall on the global supply chain disruption. It was phenomenal. It was great information that you all provided, and especially at our level, not just at the you know, very high corporate level that you hear on the news day in, day out. I do want to the business community that is out there right now watching this, you know, our virtual event. You know, a lot of you are clients of the Small Business Development Center program. I mean, please reach out to your business advisor if you have not, and speak to him or her on, you know, how they can help you on your supply chain issues and how to pivot and really how to become resilient and recover from, you know, from this disruption that we currently have, and have that plan A through F or through Z, you know, that we've got going on right now. You can always reach out to us at our phone number at 210-458-2272. Email us. The email is there on our screen. On our website, as you see there on the bottom left, of the other you know, trainings that we have day in and day out, please do not hesitate to contact us for that. No charge, one-on-one confidential consulting. And so again, thanks to our panelists, our special guest host. It was with Dr. Roy today. She performed phenomenally. And thanks, Deidre, and thank you to the business community for joining us. You all have a great day.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.